smoke, spice, and spirits, a strange and earthy intoxication you are not in a modern dispensary or a smoky jazz club, but in the cool, dark interior of a 14th century cottage, the hearth crackling with an aromatic bundle of herbs drying over the fire. The air is thick with smoke, not the harsh bite of tobacco, which won't reach European lips for another 100 years, but the soft, fragrant waft of mugwort, henbane, and wormwood. The woman crouched at the fire is known as an herb wife. In the village, a healer to some, a witch to others, and an indispensable presence when someone needs a tonic for sleep, a poultice for a wound, or perhaps something to help them slip into a different kind of awareness. Her shelves are lined with dark clay jars, powdered roots, strange seeds, dried leaves curled like animal claws. Some are for healing, others for journeying. In medieval Europe, the concept of getting high was not framed with the same terminology or culture we use today. There was no word for psychoactive in Latin, no formal classification for drugs that alter perception. But humans have always sought transcendence, and in the Middle Ages, that pursuit often lay in the overlap between medicine, religion, and superstition. Getting high was a byproduct of seeking something else, closeness to God, the easing of pain, the loosening of the tongue at a feast, or a temporary escape from lives weighed down by plague, poverty, or the power of the church. One of the most common substances for this kind of altered state was henbane, a plant with yellowish flowers, streaked with purple veins, found in graveyards and waste grounds. Henbane had been used since Roman times and persisted in folk medicine in small doses. It calmed nerves or relieved toothache in larger ones. It produced vivid hallucinations, a sense of floating, and even convulsions. It was often combined with belladonna and mandrake, mixed into ointments or witches' flying salves. Despite the dramatic nickname, these salves weren't used to fly, at least not literally. They were rubbed into the skin, especially the thin membranes of the armpits or groin, allowing the powerful alkaloids to absorb into the bloodstream. What followed was often a hallucinogenic trip involving dreamlike visions, perceived flights, or transformations into animals, of course. These visions were later condemned as the work of the devil by inquisitors, but the ingredients and practices were older than Christianity itself. In monasteries and apothecaries, where literacy and access to imported goods were concentrated, different substances were in vogue. Poppy juice, or opium, was known and used, albeit cautiously. It arrived via trade routes from the Islamic world, where pharmacology was more advanced. In cities like Baghdad or Cordoba, scholars had experimented with dosage, classification, and effects, a knowledge that trickled slowly and clumsily into the West. European doctors like Hildegard of Bingen and later Paracelsus would write about soporifics and the laudanum of future centuries. But in early medieval times, opium was exotic and risky, often treated as magical rather than medicinal. Then there was alcohol, which, though not necessarily a hallucinogen, played an enormous role in altering consciousness. Nearly every person drank some form of fermented liquid, not because they were all looking to get tipsy, but because water was frequently unsafe. Beer and ale were lower in alcohol than today's standards, but still enough to make one feel fuzzy. In religious contexts, wine was the blood of Christ, and even monks brewed their own potent concoctions. But outside the abbey walls, spirits were being distilled experimentally as early as the 12th century, especially in southern Italy and Spain. This aqua vita, or water of life, was stronger than ale and quickly acquired both medicinal and recreational uses. It was prescribed to revive the weary, cheer the melancholic, and, quite often, dull the senses. Even the act of burning incense or inhaling certain herbs could create mild psychoactive effects. In sacred spaces, this was often intentional. Churches burned copious amounts of frankincense and myrrh, imported at great expense from Arabia or Ethiopia. While mostly symbolic, These substances also had slight sedative effects, more potent, though less documented, were local practices, inhaling juniper, mugwort, or wild hemp, especially in smaller chapels, folk rituals, or among rural clergy who blended Christian and pagan rites. Not to mention the herbal steam baths, where sweat and smoke intermingled in a ritual of cleansing, physical, but also spiritual and sometimes psychedelic. Cannabis, or hemp, existed across medieval Europe mainly for fiber and rope, but evidence suggests it was occasionally smoked or infused as a tea. In medieval Islamic medicine, especially in Persia and Egypt, hashish was already widespread by the 11th century. It arrived in Europe not through medical textbooks, but through cross-cultural contact, via the Crusades, Moorish Spain, or traveling merchants. While European documentation of recreational cannabis use is sparse before the early modern era, records of its psychoactive properties appear in legal trials, confessions extracted by inquisitors, and treatises warning against the devil's lettuce, though not in those exact words. What's striking about the medieval attitude to intoxication is its ambiguity. Altered states were both revered and feared. Mystics like Julian of Norwich or Mechthild of Magdeburg described spiritual ecstasies that today might be interpreted as trance states, and perhaps they were, whether brought on by fasting, illness, or herbal tinctures. Their visions were treated with cautious awe. A woman having visions might be considered a prophet or a heretic. A man who drank deeply could be jolly at one feast and burned for sorcery the next. The medieval mind did not distinguish sharply between physical, spiritual, and emotional experiences. A plant that healed the body might also heal the soul. A substance that opened the mind might, in the wrong hands, invite demons. Most people didn't seek intoxication for pleasure in the way we understand it today. They sought it for insight, for escape, or simply because the world was hard. And brief relief, even at great cost, was better than none. You imagine yourself now, sitting cross-legged in a smoky hole, a wooden cup in hand, the herbal vapor, curling upward, mingling with the stale scent of wool and rushes. You don't know if the warmth in your chest is from the mead or the mugwort. Outside, the wind howls through the thatched roofs. But inside, it's quiet. Your mind is slowing, not sleeping, drifting. But what happens when the church notices? When an herbalist's remedies become suspicious? When visions cross the line into heresy? What did it mean in the medieval world to lose control? And who got to define what that meant? The cottage is dark now. The fire has been banked low, and the scent of dried herbs clings to the rafters like a secret. You hear murmurs outside, not of wind this time, but of boots crunching the frost-hardened dirt. It is 1324, and across Europe, the church is watching more closely than ever. Getting high, or what would have once been dismissed as eccentric, even holy, is beginning to take on a new shape in the eyes of inquisitors. The herbal salves, the ecstatic trances, the uncontrollable laughter after a mug of poppy wine. They are no longer benign oddities. They are now, increasingly, signs of heresy. To understand the suspicions surrounding altered states in the late Middle Ages, one must understand the Church's fragile hold on authority. After centuries of growth, the Roman Catholic Church found itself in a strange paradox. It dominated life from cradle to grave. Baptisms, markets, harvests, marriages, and burials were all governed by the Church's rhythms. And yet, in every hamlet, there were other rhythms, older ones, solstice rites, fertility charms, dream, interpretation, local saints with stories that veered uncomfortably close to the old gods. This tension became even more pronounced when someone claimed to have seen visions, especially when those visions suggested divine truths that didn't align with church doctrine. Altered states of consciousness had long played a role in Christian mysticism. Monks fasted until they hallucinated angels. Hermits spent years in caves and returned with stories of visions and divine messages. Saints were often credited with supernatural dreams or ecstatic experiences. But there was a delicate line between the holy and the heretical. The key distinction, at least according to the church, was whether the vision reinforced orthodoxy or undermined it. Take, for instance, the case of Marguerite Porete, a French mystic executed in 1310. She belonged to the Beguines, a lay Christian movement that emphasized spiritual freedom and inner knowledge. Marguerite described in her writings a kind of ego death, a mystical state of union with God so complete that the soul no longer needed the church. Her words were likely not the product of any herbal enhancement, but the intensity of her descriptions, the dissolution of self, the annihilation of will, mirrored the effects of certain psychoactive experiences. Her ideas were labeled dangerous. She was burned alive for heresy. Others, however, didn't write books. They brewed potions, whispered prayers over boiling kettles, and rubbed bombs into skin under moonlight. The term, which as we now understand, it didn't take firm root until the 15th century. But the groundwork was already being laid in the early 1300s. Women, and occasionally men, who used herbs to heal, to soothe childbirth, to bring on sleep, or even to stir visions, were increasingly lumped into a new, threatening category. These were not simply country healers. They were said to fly at night, consort with demons, and perform acts of magic that drew their power not from God, but from the devil. This is where the church's relationship with intoxication takes a darker turn. Substances that once had medicinal or spiritual purposes, henbane, mandrake, belladonna, became evidence not of healing, but of diabolical pact. The famed witch's salve was said to cause its user to fly to Sabbath gatherings, commune with dark forces, and lose all sense of morality. In many witch trial testimonies, usually extracted under torture, accused women confessed to using salves that made them dream of flying over fields, dancing with devils, or engaging in carnal rites. Modern historians argue these visions were likely induced by tropane alkaloids, a class of chemicals found in nightshade plants. These substances could cause euphoria, confusion, and vivid hallucinations. But the church took no interest in chemistry, only confession. The tension between folk medicine and institutional authority wasn't limited to women or rural areas. Consider Roger Bacon, a 13th century English philosopher and friar. He was one of the earliest Europeans to write about gunpowder, optics, and importantly for our story, the medicinal potential of plants. Bacon believed that certain herbs could extend life, heighten perception, or induce visionary states that brought one closer to understanding divine truth. His work straddled the line between alchemy and science, between piety and curiosity. Yet his books were scrutinized for heretical ideas, and he spent the later part of his life under church supervision. Even curiosity, in the wrong dosage, was intoxicating. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, where the science of medicine and the understanding of drugs was far more advanced, substances like opium, hashish, and even psychedelics like blue lotus or Syrian rue were studied systematically. Physicians like Avicenna ibn Sina documented the effects of these plants in encyclopedic detail. His canon of medicine remained a standard text in Europe for centuries, and yet, by the time those ideas filtered into Latin Christendom, they were treated with deep suspicion. Muslim knowledge was both admired and feared, accepted when it aligned with Christian understanding, and rejected when it hinted at alternative cosmologies or, worse, pleasure for pleasure's sake. The idea that pleasure might be a goal in itself was especially dangerous. The church was, in many ways, a theology of control, of the flesh, of the spirit, of the mind. Intoxication, unless explicitly sacramental like the wine at Mass, was suspect. What did it mean to enter an altered state without permission, without a priest, without a saint's relic under your tongue? Such experiences could not be trusted. They had to be demonized. And yet, the people persisted. In village celebrations, the line between sacred and profane blurred. Feasts honoring local saints often included generous quantities of wine or ale, communal dancing, and herbal infusions. Traveling minstrels carried not just songs, but recipes, tales of intoxicating herbs, exotic seeds, and legends of dream. Drinkers in far-off lands, pilgrims who returned from the Holy Land whispered about cannabis using salves, or monasteries in the desert where monks inhaled strange smoke. Most of these stories were garbled, half imagined, but some held kernels of truth. In the town square, behind closed shutters, someone might still be rubbing a salve on their chest, not to summon the devil, but to forget, just for a while, the ache in their joints, the hunger in their belly, the child lost to fever, to feel, for a fleeting moment, that they had stepped outside the world, that time had slowed, that their thoughts were no longer their own, but floating, weightless, somewhere else. But this carried risk. In a world where dreams were dangerous, and the body was a battleground for salvation, who had the right to escape reality? Even for a moment, what if your neighbor saw you smiling at nothing? What if your child mentioned your funny tea? What if the Inquisitor came knocking? The world did not change overnight, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, the landscape of altered states and medieval Europe began to shift. The shadows grew longer for those who still brewed mugwort or crushed poppy heads into honeyed wine. The practice didn't disappear. It simply changed form, adapted, went quiet. And in the silence that followed, a new kind of intoxication was preparing to take root, not born of forest herbs and whispered charms, but of glass beakers, colonial goods, and the steady creep of global trade died in the 14th and 15th centuries. The church's grip on consciousness tightened further. As universities grew in Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, medical knowledge became more formalized, and with it, access to psychoactive remedies was placed increasingly in the hands of trained male physicians. The wise woman and her herbor were pushed to the margins. Herbalism was not eliminated, but ghettoized, no longer seen as trustworthy healing, but as backward, potentially dangerous folk knowledge. And this marginalization had legal teeth. In 1484, Pope Innocent VIII issued the bull Summas Desiderants, which formally authorized the Inquisition to prosecute witchcraft as heresy. It specifically noted the use of herbs, unguents, and potions believed to cause hallucinations, flight, or transformations. This edict would help justify the publication of the infamous Malleus Maleficarum, hammer of which is just 2 years later. In its pages, a disturbing picture emerges. Midwives turn poisoners, herb wives turn demon worshippers. The plants once associated with spiritual journeys or healing dreams were now evidence of a pact with Satan. The irony is inescapable. Many of the substances condemned in those trials, belladonna, henbane, mandrake, would later be studied, synthesized, and even used in modern medicine. Belladonna is now used in small doses to treat motion sickness and muscle spasms. Mandrake contains scopolamine, which is found in contemporary anesthetics. What had once been burned alongside the women who used them became ingredients in medical laboratories centuries later. By the 16th century, new intoxicants flooded Europe, not from forests and hedgerows, but from the ships of empire. Tobacco arrived from the Americas, brought by Spanish explorers who were fascinated and scandalized by indigenous smoking rituals. Coffee and opium entered through Ottoman and North African trade. Chocolate, once sacred to the Maya and Aztecs, became a stimulant consumed by European elites in salons and courts. These new substances were exotic, commercialized, and crucially, they entered Europe with the backing of powerful trade companies, not country healers. What this meant was a slow replacement of the old, localized forms of intoxication with globalized, monetized, and more respectable ones. Smoking, once condemned as a pagan ritual, was now a fashion among courtiers. Laudanum, a tincture of opium and alcohol, became a standard remedy for sleeplessness, melancholy, and women's ailments in the 17th and 18th centuries. It was sold in bottles with Latin labels and elegant etchings, no longer the witch's brew, but a gentleman's tonic. Meanwhile, the old ways, ointments rubbed into the skin, wild herbs gathered by moonlight, salves to loosen the spirit, became stories, warnings, legends whispered to children. And yet, they never vanished. In quiet corners of Europe, people continued to use mugwort for dreams, valerian for calm, henbane in cautious doses for pain. In Slavic lands, old rituals involving birch smoke and sweat lodges survived. In Celtic regions, the second sight and visionary herbs persisted. In folklore, in Germanic territories, village herb women still offered teas and tinctures quietly, always quietly. The line between healer and heretic was thinner than ever. Perhaps the most telling survival was in language. Even today, the word high evokes flight, elevation, otherworldliness. In medieval texts, similar experiences were described using the language of ascent, being lifted in spirit, carried up, transported by vision. The vocabulary of medieval mysticism was, in its own way, a map of altered consciousness, one shaped by prayer and discipline, but not immune to pharmacological help. Modern scholars looking back now ask, how much of what we call religious ecstasy was pharmacologically assisted? How many visions were chemical as well as spiritual? The truth, of course, is unknowable. The records are fragmentary. The testimonies filtered through scribes, inquisitors, and suspicious neighbors. But the possibility lingers that the medieval world, with all its fear and fire and faith, was also a world of unspoken dreams. That beneath the cloisters and cathedrals, the alehouses and abbeys, there was a quiet, pulsing current of altered thought, whispered among those who knew which root to chew, which flower to burn, and when to listen. For the moment the world tilted slightly, just enough to step through. And now, you're back in that small cottage. The hearth is cold. The jar of dried henbane has been sealed. The herb wife is gone, perhaps to another village, perhaps to the grave. The inquisitors moved on. The world went on. But the smoke lingers in the rafters. You can still smell it, faint but unmistakable, sharp, sweet, earthy. You close your eyes, and you wonder, if someone found that salve today and used it, would they see what she saw? Oars, sails, and the stomach of the seed is dawning. A Mediterranean harbor, the kind that doesn't exist anymore. The sea is oily calm, barely moving, and the gulls circle overhead in bored, sweeping arcs. You're not on the deck of a glorious warship mid-battle. You're down near the waterline, standing on a creaking wooden plank, trying to rub the sleep from your eyes before your shift begins. This is what naval warfare meant for most ancient sailors. Not glory or flames or victory songs, but hours of rowing, waiting, vomiting, and following orders barked in languages not quite your own. The trireme, a Greek invention, was the backbone of many Mediterranean navies from around the 7th century BC to the 4th. The name literally means three oar, referring to the 3 rows of oars stacked vertically along the ship's sides. These weren't elegant vessels. They were loud, wet, cramped, and highly unstable. Each trireme required about 170 rowers, packed in at tight intervals, backs bent, bodies oiled so they wouldn't stick to the benches during long hauls in the sun. Most of them weren't citizens. They were medics, slaves, mercenaries, whoever was available, whoever could pull an oar in rhythm. The ancient naval experience started long before the ship left port. It began in the dry dock, with timber procurement, with weeks of shipwrights arguing about grain direction and pitch ceiling. Wood was everything: fir for the hull, pine for the oars, cedar or oak if you were lucky enough to afford it. Every warship required an army of carpenters and caulkers, and just as importantly, a bureaucracy of quartermasters and scribes to account for the expenses. The average trireme took several months to build, often longer if timber was scarce. It was said in Athens that one of the only things more expensive than starting a war was preparing for one at sea. Once afloat, ships required constant maintenance. Oars cracked under pressure, ropes frayed in the sun, sails mildewed in wet weather. Many navies, including the famed Athenian fleet, couldn't even keep their vessels in the water year-round. They were hauled onto land between campaigns and covered in canvas, with crews temporarily disbanded. A logistical headache that frustrated admirals and kept scribes up at night balancing resource ledgers. Then, there were the men themselves. Contrary to popular myth, ancient navies weren't always filled with highly trained seamen. The reality was often more ad hoc. After all, rowing wasn't an elite task. It was labor. While some city-states like Athens maintained a regular naval force in times of war, fleets were swollen with conscripts, seasonal laborers, and prisoners offered reduced sentences in exchange for service. The result? Chaotic training, spotty loyalty, and plenty of seasickness. Ancient sources report frequent illness aboard ships. Not surprising, considering that most mariners had little experience with sea travel and spent the voyage inhaling tar fumes and the scent of spoiled grain. Food on board was barely adequate. Salted fish, barley cakes, dried olives. Water turned brackish quickly, so sailors drank diluted wine, not enough to get drunk, but enough to make the water safe. If you were lucky, there might be a dried fig or two, a wedge of hard cheese. If you were unlucky, the rations might arrive moldy. Supply lines often broke down, especially during long naval standoffs. A sailor might spend days at sea with a headache, diarrhea, and only a bit of gritty bread to chew. Discipline was strict. A trireme's effectiveness relied on perfect timing. Rowers had to move together, or the whole vessel slowed, veered off course, or snapped an oar. To maintain rhythm, some navies used pipers or beat drummers. Others relied on shouted cadence from the boatswain. Mistakes brought swift punishment. Whips were common, public floggings weren't unheard of, and desertion, punishable by death, assuming you weren't caught and immediately chained to an oar instead. What's often forgotten in the heroic depictions of naval battle is how rare true sea engagements were. Warships spent far more time patrolling, escorting merchant vessels, ferrying troops, or simply waiting in harbors while generals bickered over strategy. There were entire campaigns where fleets sat idle, crews growing restless, supplies dwindling, and the smell of unwashed bodies thickening beneath the decks. For every climactic sea battle like Salamis or Actium, there were dozens of naval operations that amounted to very little. A game of waiting, disease, and slowly rotting wood still. When battles did happen, they were brutal. Ancient naval warfare wasn't about boarding or cannon fire. It was about speed and geometry. The trireme's primary weapon was its bronze-sheathed ram, positioned low at the prow. The goal was to angle your ship so you could strike the enemies, hull near the waterline, ideally from the side, and either splinter it or render it unsteerable. The challenge? Doing so while 170 rowers worked in perfect unison, while dodging missiles, while keeping the rhythm in your ears and the ear out of your neighbor's back. When ships collided, it wasn't always clean. Sometimes they got tangled. Sometimes they rebounded. Sometimes both vessels were crippled. In those moments, hand-to-hand fighting erupted, not the theatrical swordplay of film, but frantic, awkward combat with spears and axes, often on slick decks, surrounded by screaming, burning tar, and the very real fear of drowning. But even in these rare moments of chaos, most sailors never fought. They stayed at their oars, waiting to be told when to row, when to back water, when to flee. Their job wasn't to win glory. It was to keep the ship moving, not to think, not to hesitate. And when the battle was done, they rowed home, exhausted, blistered, and hungry. So much of ancient naval warfare was a matter of logistics, not heroism. Did your admiral secure enough timber in time? Did your boatswain distribute clean water? Did your enemy lose more men to disease than you did? Were your oars timed by a decent drummer? These were the questions that shaped campaigns, and you can almost hear it now. In the quiet pre-dawn before the next patrol, the creak of dry wood, the slap of salt water, the weary shuffling of sandals on deck. It wasn't the smell of victory. It was the smell of wet rope, mildew, sweat, and oil. That was war, at sea, in the ancient world. But what did it mean to live like that day after day? To serve on a ship that might never see battle, to row without ever knowing who was winning, or why. Let's leave the deck for a while. Let's go and land, not to a battlefield, but to a warehouse, or better yet, to an office. Yes, ancient naval warfare had offices. They were dusty, low-ceilinged, often damp from the sea air, and crowded with scribes whose job was not to fight, but to track, ink on clay, ink on papyrus, wax tablets if they could afford it, everything about a warship, from the grain allotted, to the rowers to the pitch needed to coat the hull, had to be written down, requested, justified. In many ways, the war at sea began in the accounts room. Take the Athenian navy at its peak. During the 5th century BCE, it boasted over 300 triremes, a stunning number, especially for a single city-state. But how did they maintain that fleet through an incredibly complex system of triarchies, a kind of civic naval duty? Wealthy citizens were appointed, or rather required, to outfit and maintain a ship for a year at their own expense. It was seen as a noble and expected form of public service, but it was also a logistical nightmare. Triarchs had to hire crews, secure rations, pay for repairs, and often faced ruinous costs. A single trireme, if poorly managed, could empty the pockets of even the wealthiest aristocrat. Some triarchs tried to cut corners: cheaper wood, fewer spare sails, underpaid rowers. Others hired co-triarchs to split the burden or bribed their way out of service. This led to endless legal disputes, petitions, and audits. Athenian naval officials had to inspect ships, review budgets, and mediate conflicts. One could spend more time arguing over invoices than planning naval strategy. In this way, the sea war effort was less about thunderous battles and more about endless paperwork. Even in mighty Rome, centuries later, the sea was more spreadsheet than sword. The Romans were famously land-focused early in their history. When they first decided to build a navy, during the First Punic War in the 3rd century BCE, they had no real maritime experience. Their solution? Capture a Carthaginian quinquereme, disassemble it, and copy it plank for plank. It was reverse-engineered naval warfare, careful, methodical, and hilariously inefficient. The result was a fleet that looked impressive but struggled in practice. Early Roman sailors got seasick easily. They didn't know how to tack into the wind. Whole fleets were lost in storms simply because no one had the experience to read the weather. So the Romans turned to a different kind of innovation. Not better ships, but better logistics. They invested in ports, supply chains, repair stations, and a system for producing parts in bulk, rather than improve seamanship overnight. They made seafaring idiot-proof. A Roman warship wasn't elegant, but it could be replaced. Roman admirals relied less on brilliant maneuvers and more on ensuring their fleets outlasted the enemies. Victory by attrition, an accountant's dream. Meanwhile, the Phoenicians, who had been seafaring long before Rome or Athens knew how to hold an oar, quietly mastered the business of ships. Their approach to naval warfare was inseparable from trade. Cities like Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos saw ships as multi-purpose investments that could transport goods, conduct diplomacy, and wage war, often in the same voyage. Their ships were sleek, fast, and crewed by professionals. While others struggled to build and fund their fleets, the Phoenicians sold timber, purple dye, and glassware, and returned with silver, slaves, and spices. Their warships weren't always the largest, but they were among the best run. Efficiency, not raw power, was their secret. Even Carthage, their greatest colonial city, viewed naval strength as a matter of economy. Shipyards in Carthage functioned like production lines. Greek historians describe them as almost industrial in their design. Massive enclosed docks with compartments for storing parts, oars, and sails, allowing dozens of ships to be constructed or repaired at once. Naval officers doubled as managers, handling inventory, labor disputes, and scheduling. The average Carthaginian admiral probably spent more time with engineers than with his men. It's easy to forget, in the drama of battle scenes, that naval power was inseparable from supply. Every ship required fresh water, salted provisions, weaponry, repair kits, animal fat for lubricating pulleys, linen for sails, and pitch to waterproof the hull. And because ancient ships hugged the coastlines, they needed allies, safe harbors, friendly ports, advanced scouts, and diplomatic ties. Naval warfare didn't happen far out to sea. It happened near cities, across trade routes, and within arm's reach of taxation officials. If your ship broke a rudder and no nearby city was willing to assist you, you were as good as dead. Then there's the question of money. Maintaining a navy was ruinously expensive. It required not only raw materials, but coinage, to pay oarsmen, to bribe officials, to buy supplies from increasingly mercenary markets. In desperate times, states melted down statues, raided temples, or imposed emergency taxes. In one famous episode during the Peloponnesian War, Athens even stripped gold leaf from the statues of Athena to mint coin for its ships. It wasn't just a naval emergency, it was a theological one. What this tells us is that ancient naval warfare wasn't just fought by sailors and admirals. It was fought by merchants, dock workers, scribes, priests, carpenters, debt collectors, and tax farmers. It was won or lost in warehouses, on ledgers, and in courtrooms. Naval strength was a reflection of a state's administrative strength. If you could keep the system moving, if you could keep your hulls watertight, your oars straight, your ledgers balanced, you could win a war without ever fighting a decisive battle. And yet, it was fragile. All of it. Timber ran out, copper mines dried up, corruption spread. Allied ports turned neutral. Then hostile storms came. Crews deserted. Bureaucracies grew bloated and slow. What began as a marvel of logistics could collapse in months. Imagine the frustration of an admiral ready to sail, only to be told the hemp ropes hadn't arrived, or that the pitch barrel shipment was delayed, or that the rowers were refusing to board until they were paid, or that your flagship's rudder was warped and the shipwrights were on strike. You might have the strategy, you might even have the will, but you weren't going anywhere. You were standing at the prow of a warship again, not as a rower now, but as a commander, not a mythical hero, not an Alexander or a Caesar, but one of the dozens of forgettable naval leaders whose names survive only in half-erased inscriptions or obscure ledgers. The day is hot, the sea is almost to calm, and you're squinting into the distance, trying to read the wind and guess whether your rival admiral will risk a confrontation or pull back to safer harbors. The men below are bored and sweaty. Some haven't eaten properly in days, and you, for all your chores and experience, have no clear plan beyond keeping your ships afloat. This is the often forgotten burden of ancient naval warfare. Not the tactical brilliance that gets carved into marble or sung by poets, but the loneliness of command. An admiral could do everything right and still lose a fleet to weather, to timing, to bureaucracy, or to a rival's bribe. And the sea didn't care. It didn't care about politics. It didn't care who had the better strategy. It only cared whether your hull was intact when the storm arrived. Consider the Battle of Arginusae in 406 BCE, a rare Athenian victory late in the Peloponnesian War. The Athenians, using newly built ships and relatively inexperienced crews, managed to defeat a Spartan fleet. But the triumph was short-lived. A storm prevented the rescuing of hundreds of shipwrecked sailors. When the fleet returned, Instead of being celebrated, the commanders were put on trial for negligence. Several were executed. The battle had been won, but the politics of grief, blame, and public perception drowned the victory. The sea was not the enemy. The city was. There are countless stories like this. Admirals recalled and punished for decisions they didn't make. Crew members executed for desertion, even when their ships had already sunk. Promises made in port, broken at sea, and through it all, a sense of grinding repetition. Patrol, repair, resupply, drill. Wait, some commanders tried to make the best of it. They gave speeches, conducted shipboard games, ordered musicians to perform. But morale was always fragile, especially in fleets composed of conscripts and mercenaries. These men didn't sail for glory. They sailed because they were paid or forced or fleeing worse options on land. The moment a campaign dragged on too long, or payment faltered, or provisions ran short, discipline began to crack. Mutinies happened, even on prestigious fleets. Ships deserted. Orders were ignored. There were also the accidents, fires, collisions, sickness that spread below deck before anyone could respond. Triremes were fast but fragile. One bad maneuver, and you were either beached or sinking. And the sea wasn't generous with second chances. A broken rudder could mean slow death by dehydration. A snap mast might leave a ship drifting for days, even weeks. Sharks were real, exposure was deadlier. And sometimes, ships simply disappeared. Caught in storms, swallowed by the sea, never heard from again. There were no black boxes, no flares, just silence. Even after battles, the work wasn't done. Dead had to be counted, if they could be. Ships needed to be towed back or burned. Wounded sailors often went untreated for days, bandaged with scraps, if at all. Injuries below deck, broken ribs from our collisions, dislocated shoulders from rowing strain, infections from splinters or tar burns were slow killers. Medical care was basic. The surgeon, if present at all, had more experience with battlefield amputations than seaborne diseases. Then came the awkward rituals of victory, celebrations that didn't feel joyful, sacrifices to Poseidon or Mars or whichever god had supposedly granted favor, prisoners chained in hot, damp holds, loot counted and sometimes fought over, crews complaining that they hadn't been rewarded fairly, and looming over everything, the next campaign, the next set of orders, the next rival fleet rumored on the horizon. In the background, always, were the politics back home. In Athens, naval strategy was debated in the assembly, often by men who had never set foot on a trireme. In Rome, senatorial alliances shaped fleet deployments. In Carthage, decisions were made by wealthy merchant councils balancing profit and defense. Commanders at sea were often far from these discussions, left to interpret vague instructions with insufficient supplies, navigating both weather and political ambiguity. And yet, despite everything, navies endured, men still rode, ships were still built. Empires rose and fell on the strength of their fleets, not because it was glorious, but because it was necessary. Control of the sea meant control of trade, communication, and access. Fleets protected grain shipments, ferried legions, carried ambassadors and tribute. A functioning navy was less about war, more about presence, the ability to show the flag, to exist visibly, to remind others that you could project force, even if you didn't use it. In this way, ancient naval warfare was less like a storybook battle and more like a network of moving parts, floating extensions of cities tied together by rope, coin, and fear. Victory was rarely sudden. More often, it was the slow suffocation of rivals, the wearing down of resistance through embargoes, patrols, ship counts, and quiet shows of force. The sea belonged not to the boldest fighter, but to the most boring planner. So, what remains now? The ships are long gone, rotted and sunken. The names of the rowers are lost. The bureaucrats are forgotten. Even many admirals exist only as a footnote in a larger war. But their labor, the rowing, the scraping, the sealing, the planning, left a mark, trade routes that still echo their patrols, languages and ports shaped by their presence, laws, born from their needs, borders drawn by the wake of their slow, creaking ships. And maybe that's the legacy of ancient naval warfare, not the clash of bronze, but the rhythm of oars, not the roar of battle, but the silence after, not the storm, but the calm between. Born in the dust, the early years of a forgotten prince, you are in a dry valley in the land the Greeks would later call Persia. The mountains are jagged and ancient, the soil is hard, barely yielding barley and sheep fodder. But to the people who live here, the early Persians, this land is not poor. It is sacred, shaped by sky gods and seasonal rhythms. The kind of place where lineage matters more than luxury. You are watching a small child walk barefoot through the gravel dust, unnoticed by history, unnamed by poets. For now, Cyrus, not yet the great, not yet the empire builder, just a boy born sometime around 600 BCE, probably in the modest hill town of Anshan. His father, Cambyses I, was a local king of a minor tribe, the Achaemenids, vassals of a much stronger overlord, the Medes. This was an age of interwoven allegiances, where no crown stood entirely alone. The world of Cyrus' youth was not carved in marble, but scribbled in treaties and blood. His people were ruled by others, and Cyrus was born beneath the weight of both inheritance and submission. If later legends are to be believed, and they often mix truth with myth, Cyrus' early life was threatened before it even began. According to Greek historian Herodotus, the Median king Astyages had a dream that his daughter's son would overthrow him. To prevent this, he ordered the newborn Cyrus killed. The child was handed to a herdsman for disposal. But as the story goes, the herdsman and his wife raised him in secret instead. Whether this is true or simply royal propaganda crafted after Cyrus' rise, it reveals how deeply the ancients believed in fate. Even your enemies could not stop your destiny if the gods willed it. By the time Cyrus reached adulthood, the geopolitical map was cracking. The Medes, his overlords, were powerful but fragile, relying on a web of local rulers who were increasingly restless. The Babylonians to the west were watching carefully. So were the Lydians and the remnants of Assyrian power. Cyrus inherited more than a crown from his father Cambyses. He inherited a chance, the kind of opportunity that only emerges once in a century, a moment when old powers weaken just enough to let someone new slip through. But Cyrus' greatness didn't come from a single moment of conquest. It came from a lifetime of calculated decisions. His genius was not how he fought, but how he convinced others not to fight him. Unlike many conquerors, Cyrus understood the value of local loyalty. When he began challenging Median authority around 550 BCE, he didn't burn villages or salt the fields. He won allies by promising them a better arrangement. His rebellion was less a civil war than a quiet shift in allegiance. Governors, satraps, and generals quietly switching sides. By the time he defeated Astyages, the transition was remarkably smooth. The Medes became part of his power base, not his rubble. He didn't destroy their institutions, he adopted them. He didn't erase their culture, he honored it. This was Cyrus' method, and it would become the blueprint for empire building for centuries to come. Conquest, yes, but conquest with care. In the years that followed, Cyrus expanded slowly, deliberately. He moved west into Anatolia, where the Lydians under King Croesus, famed for his wealth, misjudged him badly. The Lydians had war chariots and gold. The Persians had endurance and simplicity. The war ended not in a glorious duel, but in a siege and a winter standoff, with Cyrus ultimately absorbing the richest kingdom in the region. Again, Cyrus did not annihilate Croesus. Some accounts even suggest he spared him, keeping him on as an advisor, whether fact or later invention. It reflected how Cyrus wanted to be seen, not as a destroyer, but as a wise king of kings. Then came Babylon, the great, decadent, defiant city. In 539 BCE, Cyrus approached it not with flaming torches but with strategy. The Babylonians were divided, their king unpopular, their god said to be restless. Cyrus' army diverted the Euphrates River, slipping into the city through the drained riverbed. There was little resistance. According to the famous Cyrus Cylinder, a clay document often cited as an early human rights charter, Cyrus entered the city peacefully, restored local temples, and allowed deported peoples to return home. It was this action, especially his decree allowing the Jews to return to Jerusalem, that earned him a place in the Hebrew Bible as a divinely favored ruler. But again, don't let the poetry fool you. Cyrus was not a sentimental man. He was a master of image and message. When he returned gods to their temples, it wasn't because he believed in all of them. It was because he knew their followers would believe in him. He understood that empires aren't built just on walls and swords, but on stories and permissions. You didn't have to love Cyrus. You just had to see that life under him would continue more or less as before, and maybe even improved. By now, his empire stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus Valley, a vast, multilingual, multi-ethnic empire stitched together not by cultural homogeny, but by pragmatic tolerance. Cyrus did not try to turn all peoples Persian. He let them remain who they were, so long as they paid tribute and recognized his rule. In this way, his empire became not a monolith, but a federation of federations, where local identities remained intact within a much larger political frame. And yet, we know almost nothing of Cyrus the man. No letters survive, no speeches in his own words, no portraits drawn from life. What we have is the echo, the inscriptions praising him, the enemies who begrudgingly admired him, the cities that continued functioning long after their conquest. Perhaps that is the truest measure of his legacy, that the systems he built outlived him. But in this moment, in the quiet calm before his final campaign, Cyrus is simply a man of around 60, riding through a desert province, inspecting the fortifications, perhaps wondering whether the empire he built would hold once he was gone. And this leads us to the final question of this first chapter. Did Cyrus truly believe in the gods that elevated him, or did he simply understand better than anyone else how to act like one? You are riding northwest along a freshly beaten track that did not exist a decade ago. The hooves of your horse kick up chalk white dust, but the road beneath is surprisingly smooth. Its ruts packed by thousands of carts before you. Every 20 or so miles a low stone post marks the distance, inscribed in 3 scripts, Old Persian for the king's court, Elamite for the scribes of the plateau, and Aramaic for almost everyone else. This is not a royal parade route meant to impress foreign dignitaries. It is the embryo of something far more mundane and world-changing, an integrated network of couriers, ration stations, fodder depots, and relay stables. It will later earn the Greek name Angarium, but for now the Persians call it simply the King's Road. The road is the most boring thing Cyrus ever ordered, and therefore the most revolutionary. Conquest is momentary, administration is daily. Cyrus knows that to hold land stretching from the Aegean to the Iranian plateau, he must do more than win battles. He must shrink distance itself. So he tasks surveyors to mark winter-proof routes, requisitions timber to bridge seasonal rivers, and sets overseers and walled caravans array stocked with barley, hay, lamp oil, and dried dates. A courier with the king's seal can now gallop from Sardis to Susa in less than 2 weeks, changing horses at every post. The feat will astonish Herodotus. Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor gloom of night stays these couriers long before. It becomes a postal motto. It is a logistical creed dot at each relay. You meet another layer of the empire's quiet machinery. There is the rakib, the rider carrying tablets wrapped in oiled leather. The metados, who tallies fodder used and issues. Fresh warrants, the furrows, a small detachment of infantry tasked with discouraging thieves. And the logogrammates, a bilingual scribe noting every arrival in wax. None of them will make epic poetry, yet they keep governors informed of grain shortages, warn satraps of flooding on the Tigris, and relay the birth of a royal heir faster than a rebellion can spread.
The satrap and his legicyrus borrows the word satrap, Verfaven protector of the realm, from earlier Median usage, but he quietly redefines the job. A satrap may wear local dress, worship local gods, and issue local edicts. Yet he too is tethered by ledger and seal. Each spring, envoys leave Susa carrying blank tablets stamped with royal bullheads. A satrap must record tribute, silver talents, dyed wool, timber, horses, sometimes children destined for service at court, and sign his own name beneath. The tablet returns on the same road where treasury clerks cross, check figures against last year's harvest reports. Discrepancies earn polite letters, then stern letters. Then an audit squad accompanied by soldiers. It sounds oppressive, but to many provincial elites the bargain is sweet. Keep order, keep taxes predictable, and the great king leaves your customs intact. Cyrus even allows conquered nobles to mint their own low-value coins, provided the reverse side bears his name in cuneiform. Greek mercenaries will later remark that life under Persia can be lighter than under feuding city-states, because the rules are boringly consistent. A multilingual clipboard walk through a satrapal palace in Lydia and you pass scribes reciting, in 3 tongues at once. Old Persian is the language of ceremonial inscriptions, read only by a narrow priest-bureaucrat caste. The workaday language of empire is Imperial Aramaic, flexible, consonant, savvy, easy to scrawl on papyrus or to scratch on shards. In Babylonia, contracts are still cut in Akkadian cuneiform. In Egypt, tax receipts add demotic glyphs for local clerks. Cyrus does not impose one script. He imposes one filing system. Clay balls impressed with cylinder seals wrap. Bundles of mixed language tablets tagged by month and satrapy. Somewhere in an archive near Pasargadae, a scribe is inventing the world's first color-coded shelving. The empire's lingua franca policy is less enlightened than expedient. Cyrus lacks the bureaucratic vanity of later kings. He only needs everyone to be understood. So he funds translators, not poets, but monotonous clerks, and exempts them from corvée labor. More than spearmen or archers, it is translators who hold the empire together, line by dull line, coin, measure, and the price of barley coinage is young in Cyrus's lifetime. Mostly confined to electrum staters stamped by Lydia, Cyrus grasps its potential but worries about counterfeiting. His interim fixes standard weights. Bronze ducks, lion-shaped ingots, and plain stone weights circulate, each marked with a royal serration pattern. When a satrap in Bactria pays tribute in 270 talents of silver, inspectors weigh the bars against these standards. Disputes are settled not by force, but by placing the suspect weight in water. If it floats, it is hollow. If it sinks too fast, alloyed with lead. Simple, boring, effective. Standard measures trickle down. Market inspectors in Sardis find butchers whose iron scales differ by more than a few drams. Beer sellers in Babylon are required to use clay jars of a specified volume. Excise officers periodically smash random jars to verify thickness. Farmers complain of meddling. Yet, within a decade, bread prices stabilize across 3,000 kilometers, a small miracle. Invisible to future chroniclers but palpable to anyone buying barley. Garrisons, without glory, Cyrus keep surprisingly few troops. In the core lands, the empire relies instead on strategic garrisons at choke points, Cilician gates, Hellespont crossings, the passes of the Zagros. Each fort is sized less for battle than for projection. A wooden palisade on a hill, a signal tower visible to the next post, a humble armory of spears and spare bowstrings. Garrison duty is dull. Soldiers write homesick ostraca, gamble with knuckle bones, repair leather jerkins, and recite watch reports that rarely change. Road clear, 2 merchants, 1 mule died, no Persians of rank passed today, yet the monotony is the point. Bandits, Weigh the risk of raiding a convoy when they know a fort sits a day's march away, able to fire beacon signals that will bring detachments from 2 more forts. The system prevents unrest not by decisive battles but by denying rebels the breathing room to gather. Safety by boredom, temples, tolerance, and tax incentives. Cyrus's most celebrated policy, restoring captive gods to their shrines, has a treasury angle. Temples are economic engines. They lend grain at interest, sponsor irrigation, hire stonemasons. A happy priesthood is a solvent priesthood, able to meet tax quotas. After Babylon's capture, Cyrus donates funds to refurbish the Eona Temple of Ishtar. Within 2 harvests, grain loans from the temple vault generate interest payable to the satrap's ledger. Meanwhile, subject peoples call him anointed and resist less. Nowhere is this clearer than Hehud, future Judah. When Cyrus decrees that exiled Judeans may return and rebuild their temple, he grants them timber from Lebanese forests tax-free. The gift is both pious gesture and balance, sheet investment. A rehabilitated province draws traders, expands agriculture, and plugs a gap along the Mediterranean corridor. The empire sings hymns to its own fiscal health. An empire of rumors despite roads and ledgers. Information still leaks slowly at the edges. In the Oxus Valley, Scythian horsemen report that new fortlets look suspiciously like staging points for expansion. In Phrygia, Greek colonists mutter that Persians will draft their sons next spring. In distant Indus towns, merchants claim a giant bronze bull devours tax delinquents in Susa. Cyrus's court sometimes encourages rumors. Fear lubricates compliance, but sometimes must quash them with proclamations carried by tired couriers, who read aloud in marketplaces until their voices crack, the shadow of overstretch be. The mid-530s BCE Cyrus rules more territory than any king before him, yet spends more nights in tent than palace. The imperial audit for year 10 of his reign, reconstructed from fragmentary tablets, shows tribute incoming, yet expenses for road stations, translator stipends, and fort repairs rising faster. Advisors warn of daimya, the moment in empires. Appetite exceeds its digestion. Cyrus listens, nods, and orders. Another campaign. His gaze turns east to the steppe, the Massagetæ, fierce in horse and bow, led by Queen Tamiris. The steppe offers no cities to tax, no temples to endow, only open grass and potential threats. Strategists whisper that conquering it will cost more than it yields. Yet Cyrus packs wagons with rope, water skins, and iron spades to dig field. Wells, the sort of dull preparation that precedes every Persian march. You stand at the edge of his mustering ground outside Pasargadae. Drawn carts creak under tents of felt. Camel drivers haggle over fodder prices. Scribes tally bundles of arrow shafts. Nothing looks heroic. Everything smells of sweat, animal fat, and damp leather. This is how an empire moves. Quietly. Methodically on boring lists. The last inspection legend says that before leaving, Cyrus walks the perimeter of his capital. Pasargadae is hardly a city, more an elongated park of gardens, pavilions, and fortified storehouses. He stops at a low limestone platform where stone cutters are carving a trilingual inscription. I am Cyrus, king of the world, the Achaemenid. He corrects a scribe's spacing, checks the grain of the block, and instructs that excess chips be ground for concrete aggregate. Perhaps he pauses at his modest tomb, already under construction, not a pyramid, but a gabled stone house on a stepped base, room enough for one sarcophagus and a few grave goods. No treasures to lure thieves, no labyrinth of chambers. Just simplicity and permanence, the same virtues he demanded of his roads. Did he foresee he would never return? The chronicles diverge. Some say he died in battle against the Massagetæ, his head dunked in a skin of blood by Queen Tamiris in vengeance. Others claim he succumbed to an infected arrow wound and was wrapped in felt for the long ride home. An administrative tablet from Babylon records a sudden spike in expenditures for mourning oil and black wool, indirect evidence, perhaps of a royal funeral. What is certain is that his death did not shatter the empire. The roads kept humming, the satraps kept stamping tablets, the relay posts kept watering horses. The machinery outlived its architect, which, in Cyrus's mind, may have been the real victory, and yet one question hangs in the hot air of the steppes, unanswered. When an empire is built on the quiet strength of systems rather than the roar of a single man, what happens when the systems themselves face their first real storm? You are standing in the heart of a palace that Cyrus never lived to. See completed. The stones still smell of lime, the pigments of the frescoes are unfaded, and the cedar timbers dragged from Lebanon at enormous coscrakes slightly in the dry Persian air. This
is not Pasargadae, but Persepolis, a city not yet built in Cyrus's lifetime, but destined to embody his legacy. Here, under Darius the Great, his vision of empire becomes brick and mortar policy. Yet even before Persepolis rises, the death of Cyrus sends a quiet ripple across the empire, not a collapse. Not chaos, but a kind of collective breath-holding. The founding father is gone. Will the road hold? The death of a conqueror is usually followed by fragmentation. But Cyrus, with uncharacteristic restraint for a man with a sword, had prepared something unusual: continuity. His sons, Cambyses and Bardia, or perhaps Gomita, the false Bardia, were not military prodigies or fiery orators. They were bureaucrats. Cambyses had already begun to learn the ropes of taxation in Babylon. Bardia had served as a provincial overseer. Both knew the rituals, the scribes, and most importantly the ledgers. Cyrus hadn't taught them how to win wars. He had taught them how not to lose provinces. 1. Cambyses, the quiet expansion Cambyses. The elder son inherits the throne and does not immediately declare a new conquest. He waits. He audits. He renews trade routes with Egypt, and only then, when grain from the Nile is flowing eastward and Aramaic scribes are in place in Gaza, does he launch the campaign. His conquest of Egypt in 525 BCE is, compared to earlier wars, almost anticlimactic. There are no dramatic betrayals or burning cities. The Persians march in with supply chains intact, scribes in tow, and a priestly letter of endorsement from priests of Marduk in Babylon. Cambyses enters Memphis not as a looter, but as a ruler wearing Egyptian robes. He pays temple staff in silver, continues existing tithes, and is ritually confirmed as pharaoh. The Egyptians are displeased, but the taxes are predictable. Yet Cambyses is not Cyrus. He begins to distrust the satraps around him. He executes a brother. He grows paranoid. On his return from Egypt, he dies suddenly, perhaps from an infected wound, perhaps suicide, perhaps poisoned by courtiers. The silence around his death is striking. No epic laments, no desperate succession. War. The empire barely flinches.2. The false Bardia. Or how a boring empire deals with a crisis after Cambyses' death. A man calling himself Bardia, Cyrus's other son, claims the throne. According to Darius, he is an impostor named Gomita, a Median magician. The story is murky. What matters more is the empire's response. Some satraps support Bardia. Others pause their tribute. For a brief period, tax ledgers go unbalanced, and relay posts fall silent. It is the dullest rebellion in world history. Darius, a distant cousin to the royal family, seizes the moment. He travels not as a warrior, but as an auditor. His inscriptions, like the famous Best in relief, frame his rise not as a divine destiny, but as the restoration of proper accounting. He punishes tax avoiders, reaffirms weights and measures, and standardizes the use of Aramaic for provincial paperwork. He stamps his seal on thousands of tablets that say essentially the same thing. The rules still apply. Most empires collapse in the space between rulers. Cyrus's legacy, however, lies in the machinery of rule, even when humans falter. The offices are still staffed, the tribute tallied, the horses fed. 3. Persian governance as a way of life. By the time Darius builds Persepolis in the early 5th century BCE, the idea of Persian order has become a lifestyle. Not just laws, but habits. markets organized by product type, receipts issued for even the smallest coin, guards rotating posts by lunar calendar. The empire is now run by mid-level officials, whose names are forgotten, but whose signature is always legible. A governor in Aria might never meet the king, but he knows exactly which form to fill out for lost livestock. The Persians issue rations with stunning precision. A worker quarrying stone for Persepolis is paid in beer, barley, and occasionally wine quantities based on role, age, and season. The tablets from these transactions survive by the tens of thousands, written in cuneiform so repetitive they put modern accountants to shame. And yet, these records speak volumes of stability, of process, of a world built on the idea that even the humblest transaction is worth remembering. It's often said Cyrus founded an empire. In truth, he founded a system. Point 4. Cultural legacy. And later imitator. Centuries later, Alexander the Great will conquer Persia and marvel at its administrative finesse. Though he burns Persepolis in a drunken rage, he retains many of the Persian civil practices, relay stations, multilingual decrees, and local governors empowered by seal. Rome will later borrow similar systems for its provinces, even the Islamic caliphates, emerging centuries after Cyrus, will rediscover his model of provincial autonomy balanced by rigid fiscal accountability. The name Cyrus will echo in religious texts. In the Hebrew Bible, he is remembered not just as a conqueror, but as a liberator. A foreign king praised for letting a conquered people return home and rebuild their temple. For centuries afterward, Cyrus is cited by theologians, philosophers, and rulers as a rare example of power without tyranny. Thomas Jefferson even owned a copy of Xenophon's Cyropaedia, a semi-fictional work about Cyrus's virtues, and considered it a manual for just leadership. Point 5. The tomb in Durastade, near the dry plains of Pasargade, a low stone tomb still stands. It is modest, unadorned, rectangular. Travelers once left flowers. Alexander himself is said to have wept there. The tomb's inscription, though likely apocryphal, has entered legend. O man, whoever you are, and wherever you come from, for I know you will come. I am Cyrus, who founded the Persian Empire. Do not begrudge me this bit of earth that covers my body. No treasure was buried with him. No gold, no jewels, just a legacy carved not in luxury, but in law, in order, in the peaceful boredom of roads that work, posts that deliver, and governors who govern. The combs, curls, and codes of the ancient world. No, imagine yourself an ancienter in a Sumerian city where trade is tracked on clay tablets and gods live in the ziggurat above. The scribes, overworked, underpaid, are always running to catch up with the latest grain ledger. But there's one thing none neglect: the shape of their beards. Beards in Mesopotamia were status symbols. A thick, well-kept beard meant leisure and access to oil. Kings wore intricately curled and tiered beards that would have taken hours to shape, with pomades made from sesame oil, bitumen, and resin. Clay figurines and wall reliefs show soldiers with trim, squared-off beards, and priests with clean-shaven faces. Even more fascinating, false beards. Some elites were braided, ornamental, beards made of silver thread or animal hair. These were tied on like wigs and worn during rituals. The beard wasn't just a biological feature, it was a badge. And for women, upper-class women in Mesopotamia wore their hair long, coiled into buns or parted at the center and looped behind the ears. In some Akkadian texts, laws were passed forbidding slaves from wearing their hair like the free. Even a haircut could be criminal. To shave a person's head in public was not just humiliation, it was erasure. You were stripping them of their name, their role, their dignity. The Mesopotamians understood that identity began at the scalp. 3. Greece. Hair is a statement of philosophy, age, and allegiance. Let us now wander into classical Greece, where sculptors love curls and philosophers love clarity. A man's hair told you not only who he was, but what he believed. Young aristocrats in Athens wore their hair long and tied in knots at the nape, a sign of wealth and physical beauty. Spartans, on the other hand, believed that long hair made a man look more dangerous in battle and more dignified in death. They would comb their hair before battle as a psychological tactic, almost like donning armor. Greek philosophers favored short, tidy hairstyles, a kind of visual rejection of vanity. Plato and Socrates were often depicted with restrained hair, neither wild nor overly groomed, signaling focus on the mind over the body. And in the gymnasia, where boys trained and debated, the haircut was almost like a uniform, clipped at the front, slightly longer in back. Women wore their hair up in buns, with braids often serving both function and fashion. During mourning, women let their hair hang loose. During marriage rituals, they braided it, symbolizing reordering the self from chaos back into structure. But Greece also gave birth to democracy, and with it, the rise of hairstyles as personal expression. A citizen could vote on law, serve on a jury, and also choose how he wore his beard, within limits, of course. Rome, the barbarous social gatekeeper across the Mediterranean in ancient Rome. Hairstyles took on an even more elaborate role here. Barbers were not just tradesmen, they were gossip hubs, political analysts, and agents of transformation. Roman barber shops were places of news exchange, where style was intertwined with ideology. Emperors often set the trend. Augustus wore a neatly combed forward fringe that many Roman men imitated. Later, Emperor Hadrian revived the full beard, which had been out of favor for generations, signaling a return to Greek intellectual values. Senators and elites often changed hairstyles with shifting political winds. One could be pro-republic or pro-emperor just by changing the direction of a part. Hairstyles also marked life stages. A Roman boy's bulla protective amulet was removed during a coming-of-age ceremony, and his hair was often cut in a ritual that marked his transition into manhood. Slaves were shaved regularly to denote ownership, and newly freed men would often grow their hair long as a statement of liberation. For Roman women, hairstyles were both architecture and advertisement. Elaborate updos with multiple braids, pens, and combs could signal wealth, fertility, or lineage. Some styles were even named after the emperor's wives. Fashion magazines didn't exist, but busts of imperial women served the same function. Do your hair like Livia, and maybe you too will. Be dignified and fruitful. Fived hair, and the borders of Belonge Gacris, all these civilizations. Hair played another powerful role defining who was us and who was them. Foreigners often wore their hair differently, and that difference could justify war, trade, or isolation. To an Egyptian, the unkempt hair of Nubian or Libyan warriors marked them as uncivilized. To a Roman, the long hair of Germanic tribes was a symbol of both fear and fascination. To the Assyrians, the clean-shaven Elamites were effeminate, while the long-bearded Persians were noble or divine, depending on political alliances. This boundary-defining aspect of hair runs deep. Hair was an early form of ID, visible from a distance, hard to fake, slow to change, and yet it was malleable enough to allow rebellion, assimilation, or disguise. Even today, echoes of this persist. In schools, armies, religious communities, and workplaces, what you do with your hair still carries meaning. It always has. You could shave it off to show grief. You could grow it long to display freedom. You could oil it to show luxury. You could braid it to show discipline. In every lock, a language in every part, a point of pride or punishment. But that leaves one question, softly hanging as you drift toward rest. If identity once began at the literal roots, how much of who we are today is still shaped by what we choose to do with our hair? You are standing in the cool, echoing corridor of a Roman villa, the scent of lavender oil faint on the breeze. But your gaze isn't on the marble columns or the flickering lamplight. It's on the girl kneeling beside a basin, her hair being combed with short, methodical strokes. The slave combing her hair works in silence, not because she must, but because this moment is ritual. Her hair, like countless others across centuries, is not merely being styled, it is being shaped into compliance. Hair has always carried weight. Not just symbolic or cultural meaning, but the real, lived weight of law, of social expectations, of power and humiliation. In many ancient societies, laws dictated how you could or could not wear your hair because to control a person's appearance was to control the person themselves. 1. Hair laws of ancient societies, regulating the scalp in ancient Babylon, Hammurabis. Code 1 of the earliest legal texts does not speak directly about hairstyles, but the cultural norms enforced by those laws included sharp distinctions between social classes, many of which were expressed visually. In Mesopotamia, for example, prostitutes were often required to wear their hair in a distinct style, typically loose, in contrast to the tightly bound hair of married women. Some scholars suggest that failure to conform could be punishable, though the exact laws are unclear. The Greeks, too, saw hair as a civic matter. In Athens, during the classical period, certain hairstyles were associated with mourning, and others with shame. A woman caught committing adultery might have her hair cut short as a form of public disgrace. For men, the famous Spartan warrior class grew their hair long as a mark of their status, and the threat of being shorn was considered deeply dishonorable. The act of cutting hair wasn't just aesthetic, it was judicial. Romans refined this even further. There were actual imperial edicts that influenced fashion. Under the reign of Augustus, certain extravagant hairstyles became fashionable among women, but when Rome descended into crisis, more modest hairstyles were encouraged as part of a broader political campaign to return to old Roman virtues. In this sense, a bun wasn't just a bun, it was a billboard dot. By the 2nd century CE, under Emperor Hadrian and others, it became common to use hairstyles to distinguish between different types of Roman women. Vestal virgins, elite priestesses dedicated to Vesta, wore their hair in a very specific 6-braid configuration called the sine crines. It was symbolic of their purity and required assistance from specialized hairdressers or ornatrices to wear. This style without being a vestal would have been unthinkable. To cut it off during a ritual punishment, almost a kind of spiritual death. To the shorn head is shame, punishment, and enslavement. Hair is intimate. It grows from your own body, slowly, quietly, like a timeline etched in keratin. To remove it forcibly, especially in front of others, has long been used as a public form of control and degradation. In ancient Rome, one of the most visible ways to identify a slave was by their hair. Many enslaved people were kept closely shaven, sometimes entirely bald, not for comfort, but as a form of symbolic erasure. No identity, no style, no personal choice, just compliance. It also served practical purposes, cleanliness and lice prevention in cramped quarters. But it also sent a message. You are not yours. When a person was freed, one of the first things they might do was grow their hair. A newly manumitted Roman might appear in public with carefully groomed curls or braids, not to flaunt wealth, but to flaunt autonomy. The act of brushing your hair in your own home, at your own time, with your own tools, was revolutionary. In Greek tragedy and mourning rituals, the cutting of hair marked a moment of existential loss. When someone died, it was customary for close relatives, especially women, to shear part of their hair in mourning. In Homer's Iliad, Achilles famously cuts a lock of his hair to place on the funeral pyre of Patroclus. That lock becomes a symbol of love, loss, and loyalty. But again, it's more than emotion. It is ritualized identity, his life, marked in strands, even outside of death. Shaved heads could mean punishment. Criminals, captured enemies, or adulterers were often forcibly shorn. In many cultures, even into the early modern period, a shaved head was the public mark of shame, one that couldn't be hidden or disguised. A scarf fades. A tattoo can be covered, but hair takes time to grow back. You were marked in slow motion. 3. Hair and gender. Reinforcement and resistance. While men's hairstyles often align with class and military expectations, women's hairstyles served an even more layered role. reflecting not just status, but behavior, morality, fertility, and submission. In many ancient societies, a woman's hair was considered a family asset, something that could affect her value in marriage. Arrangements in ancient Israel and surrounding Semitic cultures, a woman's uncovered or loose hair was often seen as a signal of seduction, rebellion, or disgrace. The Bible refers multiple times to the idea of covering or veiling a woman's hair as a sign of respect and modesty. To appear in public with unbound hair could be interpreted as either mourning or indecency. Again, context was everything. But even within this tight framework, there were quiet rebellions. Egyptian female rulers like Hatshepsut adopted male regalia, including the royal false beard, but also maintained distinctly feminine headdresses and stylings. Cleopatra, centuries later, famously used her hair to blend Greek and Egyptian iconography, reinforcing her dual heritage. Her braid was not just pretty, it was political. And in Rome, some women flaunted impossible hairstyles. We're talking towering constructions of curls, ringlets, and pens, sometimes requiring wooden frameworks beneath the hair. These were not just displays of wealth or beauty, but of time that others did not own. For some, wearing a massive hairstyle in public was a subtle rebuke to the idea that a woman should be modest, invisible, or obedient, a quiet kind of defiance built from hot irons and sheep fat. 4. Hair and the divine, ritual locks and sacred. Trimming hair was also a spiritual medium. In Hindu Vedic tradition, which, although outside the Greco-Roman world, overlaps in the ancient timeline. The ritual shaving of a child's head called mundan was considered essential to purify the soul and break ties to past lives. Similarly, in many ancient Mediterranean societies, people dedicated hair to the gods. Offerings of hair were placed in temples. In some cases, young girls would cut their hair before marriage as a form of sacrifice, offering their childhood to Artemis or another deity in return for safe passage into adulthood. Among the Celts, whose Bronze Age presence radiated into the fringes of the classical world, warriors sometimes lined their hair, washing it with chalky mixtures that made it stand on end, forming shock-like spikes. This wasn't just fashion, it was theater, a way of appearing terrifying, otherworldly, something more than human. Their hair was part of the performance of battle and belief. In contrast, ancient Buddhist monks, beginning with the early schools of India, shaved their heads entirely. This practice of tonsure was a mark of renunciation. No hair meant no vanity, no attachment. The scalp, left bare to the elements, was a symbol of imp or manence. So, while some traditions elevated hair as sacred, others sought to remove it entirely. In search of transcendence. 5. The barber's chair is a battlefield. When you walked into a barber's shop in antiquity, be it a Greek Cowrian or a Roman tantra stall, you weren't just there to get a trim. You were stepping into a subtle negotiation of power. Who were you trying to be today? Whose rules were you following? Whose defiance were you showing? Because hair had to say everything before your mouth ever opened. And yet, not everything was always compliant. In quiet corners of society, people twisted, braided, oiled, or pinned their hair in ways that subtly resisted the social expectations of their class or gender. We know of Roman women who refused to veil. We know of enslaved people who, once freed, copied the hairstyles of senators. We know of monks who wore partial tonsures that marked their regional identity rather than universal conformity. In this sense, hair became the final canvas, one not owned by gods, laws, or empires, but by the human beneath it. But it leaves you with one lingering strand of thought, a thread left untied. If hairstyles were once tools of both rebellion and repression, how many of today's quiet decisions about appearance still carry the weight of ancient expectations we no longer remember? You wake up in the early morning light of a city that no longer exists, Alexandria, perhaps, or a bustling corner of Palmyra, and the first thing you do is reach for your comb. It's wooden, delicately carved, worn down by years of use. There's no mirror nearby, only a polished dish of bronze catching the sun. And your hair, your very own crown of strands, is a task you complete quietly, daily. And without fail, you smooth it, pin it, braid it, and in that seemingly boring gesture, you are echoing thousands of years of habits, fears, hopes, and subtle social negotiation. In this final part of the story, we follow hair not just in temples or palaces, but through disease, disaster, and the daily routines of people who are mostly forgotten by history, but whose hairstyles still told entire biographies. Their choices, though invisible to us now, once broadcast their place in the world, and just as often, their hopes for leaving at point one: hair, and the unseen classes, servants, soldiers, and strangers. If a lead hair was about symbolism, poor people's hair was often about practicality. For slaves, servants, soldiers, and rural peasants, hair rarely had the luxury of adornment. But that doesn't mean it didn't matter. Archaeological combs made from wood, bone, or ivory are found scattered across ancient sites, some delicately etched, others plain. Even in mass graves from battles or plagues, traces of braids and tightly wrapped hair still appear in the surviving strands, often woven with modest cloth or bound by plant fiber. These weren't hairstyles for fashion, they were for function. Braided hair could reduce lice infestations, covered hair was protection from the sun, and tied back hair was often a necessity around fire, wheels, or tools. Among Roman soldiers stationed in the northern provinces, letters from Vindolanda, a fort in Britain, mention barbers and haircuts as part of routine military life. These weren't just for appearance. Short-cropped hair reduced the risk of lice and made helmet wearing more bearable. It also made them visibly distinct from the local barbarian populations, who were often described by Roman writers as long-haired and wild. So again, even in the mud and blood of a frontier camp, hair told a story of where you came from, who you fought for, and what you were not. Women in servitude were expected to wear their hair in simple, unobtrusive styles, often covered, sometimes shorn entirely. But interestingly, when freed, many of them began mimicking the fashionable elite, not just in clothing, but in complex hairstyles, ironically adopting the very patterns that once excluded them. In doing so, they blurred the social lines. Hair became a mask as much as a statement. Tooth epidemics and the ritual of hair removal. While hair was often a source of pride or power, it was also a vector for fear, especially during outbreaks of disease. Throughout the ancient world, hair was believed to trap corruption, spiritual impurity, and even illness. In early Islamic, Christian, and Jewish traditions, ritual washing and sometimes shaving were part of purification rites. Pilgrims going to sacred sites might remove some or all of their hair, both as a humbling gesture and to ward off disease. In times of plagues such as the Antonini Plague 2nd century CE or the Plague of Justinian 6th century CE, hair removal sometimes became widespread in cloisters, camps, and cities. Barbers were called upon not for beauty, but as hygienic workers. Some Greek medical texts even recommend shaving the head for feverish patients, believing the heat could be released through the scalp. Interestingly, the barber became one of the most feared and necessary figures in ancient cities, not because they styled hair, but because they were also responsible for minor surgeries, bloodletting, and the lancing of abscesses. A barber's blade could shape your image or save your life, or both. And yet, even amidst disease, people clung to hair as identity. There are funerary portraits from Roman Egypt, those famous mummy paintings, that show individuals with beautifully detailed hairstyles painted on the wooden boards covering their wrapped bodies. These portraits weren't mere likenesses, they were posthumous declarations. This is who I was. This is the hair I wore. This is how I want to be remembered. 3. Hairstyles as historical clues. What survives the scissor smuck of what we know about ancient hairstyles comes not from direct descriptions, but from frozen remnants, sculpture, coins, mosaics, and portraiture. And in these, hair speaks volumes. Coins of emperors and empresses often show careful styling. Empress Julia Domna, for example, wore a globe-like arrangement of tight curls that radiated political control and sophistication. By contrast, depictions of barbarians on Roman coins and reliefs often emphasize unkempt or shaggy hair. As a sign of otherness, hair, quite literally, was drawn as a boundary between civilization and chaos. In Greek statues, gods and mortals alike are distinguished by their coiffures. Apollo's flowing locks mark him as eternally youthful. Athena's plaited helmet hair identifies her as armored intellect. Even the humble Kouros statue's young male figures, placed on graves, carry standard hair designs, often long, tied, and impossibly idealized. These were not portraits. They were ideals. But hair also leaves behind more direct evidence. Mummies from ancient China's Tarim Basin show incredibly well-preserved hair. Some dyed or plaited with reeds. These individuals, preserved by the dry desert air, tell silent stories about trade, identity, and beauty that stretch across what would become the Silk Road. The diversity in their styles, blonde braids next to Asian top knots, suggests cultural blending. Long before any official histories recorded it, and in the tombs of Egyptian nobles, entire wigs were preserved, some containing human hair, some mixed with plant fibers. They had ornate braiding systems, pins, and beeswax fixatives. In life and death, these people crafted themselves from the scalp down. 4. Echoes of the ancient and modern hair. What remains fascinating is how many ancient meanings of hair still echo today, albeit softly. We still cut hair in mourning. We still use it to signify belonging, uniforms, religious life, rebellion. In many cultures, women's hair is still politicized, still legislated, still interpreted as a sign of character or conformity. Men, too, find themselves caught in expectations that are older than they realize. Military buzz cuts, for example, have Roman roots. Shaving heads in penitence or prison, that is biblical and Babylonian precursors. Even our obsession with bad hair days, grooming rituals, or new styles before major life events all trace back to ancient understandings of hair. As transformation, a haircut still marks a turning point. We shed who we were. We prepare to become someone else. And then there's hair as protest. Whether in punk spikes, unshaven armpits, dreadlocks, or hijabs, the head remains a battleground of quiet defiance. People who change their hair are often changing more than just their look. They are claiming something, and perhaps, unconsciously, continuing a ritual that's thousands of years old. 5. The eternal tangle lays. So much of history vanishes, stone crumbles, scrolls burn, empires fall. But hair, though soft and small, survives. It wraps around comb teeth, it tangles in graves, it waits in paintings and on coins. Sometimes, it even remains buried in the earth for millennia, silent testimony to who someone was and what they wanted you to see. And so, the next time you find yourself combing your hair in the mirror or tying it back without thinking, ask yourself, what version of yourself are you choosing to show consciously or not? And how many of your decisions are really your own, and not echoes of someone who lived and died long before your name was ever spoken? Waking up in the shadow of stone, you're not a pharaoh, not a priest or a general. You're someone else entirely, someone less often spoken of. Though your hands build the very things they were buried in, you are a laborer, part of a rotating crew station near the Giza Plateau, rising at first light to the sound of shouting foremen, creaking wooden pulleys, and the grunt of animals already burdened with supplies. The morning is dry, the air has yet to bake, and your day, like the thousands before it, will revolve around moving stone. Let's begin by dispelling a common myth. The pyramids were not built by slaves, or at least, not in the sense Hollywood imagines. The consensus among Egyptologists, based on decades of archaeological evidence, is that the Great Pyramid of Khufu, along with its neighbors, was constructed by a vast workforce composed primarily of skilled laborers, seasonal workers, and rotating teams of farmers who worked in shifts during the Nile's flood season. When fields were submerged and agriculture paused, they weren't unpaid. They weren't disposable. In fact, some of them had names carved on tombs. These were men with homes, families, and expectations not of glory, perhaps, but of hot meals, camaraderie, and a burial near the place they spent their lives shaping. Thousands of years later, what's left of their presence still hums beneath the sand mud brick barracks, fish bones, bread ovens, graffiti etched in limestone, and small human gestures scattered like dust along the foundations of grandeur. The village beside the Pyramida. Short walk from the Giza pyramids, less than what you'd need to cool a loaf of bread, is the remnants of a workers' village, excavated in the 1990s and early 2000s by archaeologists like Mark Lenner. The site revealed something remarkable: not poverty, not chains, but infrastructure. The village had a layout. There were dormitory-style rooms made from sun-baked bricks, designed to house teams of laborers. There were kitchens, storage silos, and even small administrative buildings. Clay seal impressions suggest that some kind of payroll or ration tracking system was in place. These weren't ragtag labor camps. They were organized settlements meant to sustain and rotate a sizable, professional workforce. There were doctors' skeletal remains show healed injuries, including broken limbs and arthritis, signs that workers received care and lived long after injury. Some skeletons show signs of heavy strain, particularly in knees, shoulders, and backs, consistent with hauling heavy materials. Yet these bodies were buried with respect, sometimes even near the pyramids themselves, and shaft tombs that suggest a kind of earned dignity. And, crucially, there were kitchens. Meals at the base of a monument list talk about the food, not the food of kings, but of the men hauling limestone under the desert sun. Each day, the pyramid workers needed staggering amounts of calories, estimated at around 4,000 to 5,000 calories per person per day. The diet wasn't luxurious, but it was sufficient and structured. It needed to be. You don't lift multi-ton stones on stale crumbs. What did they eat? The basics included bread, made from emmer wheat and barley. The bread was coarse, dense, and filled with grit from stone-ground flour, often leading to worn-down teeth by middle age. Beer, not bubbly ale, but a thick, porridge-like brew, high in calories and essential hydration in the desert heat. Onions and garlic, not just for flavor, but believed to provide strength and vitality. These appear frequently in records and were so essential that Greek historian Herodotus claimed workers were paid in them, though he likely exaggerated. Fish, caught from the Nile, and baked or dried. Tilapia and catfish were common meat, mostly goat and beef. Surprisingly, bones found in the workers' village include the remains of butchered cattle, meaning they weren't fed scraps. Feeding workers meat was a logistical choice. It was protein-dense and morale-boosting. Lentils and chickpeas, protein-rich, easy to store and cook. Dates and figs, natural sugar to round off meals, especially important in high exertion work. These foods weren't handed out randomly. Evidence suggests rations were calculated and assigned. Workers may have belonged to organized gangs, each responsible for specific tasks, and rotated in long shifts, weeks or months at a time. Their meals were part of the bargain. Show up, work hard, get fed. And while their fare lacked royal luxury, it was certainly better than famine. For many rural Egyptians, pyramid season was a chance to earn, eat well, and gain social capital, not just brute labor. Building of the Great Pyramid involved extraordinary coordination, quarrying, transporting, lifting, aligning, all without modern tools. But brute strength wasn't the only requirement. Skilled artisans carved the casing stones. Foremen recorded materials and progress with ink on a stroke of broken pottery. Engineers used plumb bobs and leveling tools to ensure precision. Rope makers, water haulers, mortar mixers all contributed in ways we rarely imagine. Some graffiti found within the pyramid scrawled by workers refer to teams with humorous nicknames, like the drunkards of Menkaure or friends of Khufu. These were ordinary people doing extraordinary labor, and apparently keeping their humor intact. One curious detail: red ochre lines drawn on blocks suggest plan placement. That means someone, likely several people, was responsible for visual coordination across tens of thousands of stones. That's not slave work, that's engineering. Even those hauling materials had methods: ramps of compacted clay and limestone. Chippings were likely used to drag blocks upward. Water was poured ahead of sleds to reduce friction, a trick confirmed in wall paintings and by modern physics tests. Again, this points to intelligence, problem solving, and team coordination. You weren't just muscle. You were part of a puzzle. Sunburn, sore backs, and sleep. So, what was life like day to day? You'd rise early, before the heat turned vicious. After a simple breakfast, maybe bread, beer, and some leftover fish, you'd report to your gang's foreman. Instructions might vary: move blocks, prepare tools, quarry rock, or haul sand. Workdays were long, but likely broken into intervals. Shaded rest, water breaks, and evening meals helped keep morale and stamina. Injuries were common, but you wouldn't be discarded. The team needed you. The tombs show signs of workers healing and returning to duty. At night, you might sit with your team around a low fire, sharing dates or telling stories. Some days, there was music. Flutes and drums have been found in nearby tombs. You might joke about the heat. You might stretch aching arms and wonder if this pyramid would actually be finished before your son had to take your place. Sleep came in simple bedding, reed mats, or wool stuff sacks. You might hear distant hammering even in dreams. The pyramid never stopped. And so, the day ends. The stones have moved just a little. You fall asleep, not in history books, but in the dust just beside them. Your life, like the ones of so many others, is woven into the scaffolding of monuments that others will mistake as the work of gods, or slaves, or magic. But you know better. You helped build them. And tomorrow, you'll wake and eat and do it all again. But how long could a life like this go on? What happened when the body broke, or when the floods failed, or when the pharaoh died? From your work post below, you can no longer see the summit. You only glimpse the blocks vanishing into the sky like a staircase for the dead. You've been here for seasons now, months of hauling, shaping, stacking. Your body has changed. Hardened, the calluses on your palms feel permanent. Your back no longer aches constantly. But you suspect that's not a good sign. You've learned to pace yourself, to save energy, to think ahead about the work, not just do it. Others weren't so lucky. Section 1 painted the daily rhythm of pyramid labor, a structured life of bread, beer, physical toil, and temporary glory. But now, in Section 2, we step deeper into the complexities beneath the stone: the physical toll, the quiet hierarchy among workers, and the systems that held everything together when men fell sick, died, or disappeared from the project altogether. Because building a monument the size of the Great Pyramid of Giza wasn't just an engineering marvel. It was a logistical, medical, and social experiment conducted in slow motion over decades. Bodies that broke, skeletons don't lie. The remains of laborers buried near the workers' village tell a rough, honest story, one that softens the grand myth of divine purpose and reminds us of the cost of human ambition. Archaeologists have uncovered numerous graves around the Giza Plateau, humble shaft tombs carved in rows with few grave goods. The bodies are not those of royalty or priests. They are ordinary men, and their bones show signs of hard labor: fractured vertebrae, crushed toes, worn down knees, degenerative joint diseases, broken limbs that healed over time. This is how we know they weren't slaves. Slaves weren't buried in this way, not with ritual, not with care, not so near to the pyramid complex. These were honored laborers, people who gave their strength and, sometimes, their lives to the pharaoh's legacy. A few even had small stone markers, a rare gesture of remembrance. One man's skeleton showed a shattered leg that had been set and allowed to heal over months, possibly years. The treatment he received indicates he wasn't cast aside. He was looked after and likely given food and rest until he could return to work. This suggests a team mindset. You weren't alone in your labor. You had a group, a foreman, perhaps even a replacement while you recovered. This wasn't modern workplace insurance, of course, but in ancient terms, it was advanced. The chain of command as the pyramid grew, so did its human infrastructure. Building it required more than just brute force. It needed people who could manage labor, track supplies, assign jobs, and enforce hierarchy. At the top were the overseers, likely connected to royal or priestly classes. They rarely touched tools themselves but moved about with scrolls, counting blocks and workers. Below them were scribes, tracking food rations, injuries, progress, and materials. Their records painted on a strata and walls are a kind of ancient clipboard. Then came the skilled tradesmen, masons, stone polishers, sculptors. These men were responsible for the finishing touches, the casing stones, the symmetry that still mystifies tourists today. They often lived slightly apart from the common laborers, in more permanent homes with better cooking facilities. Finally, at the base of the ladder were the haulers, the lifters, the sand clearers, the anonymous many. Their jobs were the most punishing, their tools the simplest, their names least likely to be remembered. Still, all these layers work together. Graffiti deep within the pyramid reveals the existence of gangs, work crews, with names and identities. Some were humorous, the friends of Khufu or the drunkards of Menkaure. These names suggest bonding, rivalries, and a worker culture beyond blind obedience. Some gangs specialized in particular tasks, hauling interior blocks, preparing ramp paths, or maintaining pulley ropes. Each knew its role. And at the center of this pyramid economy was food. Feeding the Enganites. Easy to picture the pyramid as an isolated structure, but in truth, it was embedded within a web of logistical planning. Materials arrived from across Egypt, limestone from Torah, granite from Aswan, copper tools from the Sinai, timber from Lebanon. But the most important daily import was bread. Massive communal bakeries had been found near the workers' village. These weren't kitchen hearths, they were production facilities. Dozens of clay ovens, enormous mixing vats, grain storage pits, and grinding stones testified to an industrial-scale effort. One estimate suggests that workers consumed around 21 cattle and 23 sheep or goats per day, in addition to hundreds of loaves of bread and large amounts of beer. That's not extravagance, that's calories. Why so much meat? Partly to boost morale, but also because hauling stones required intense energy and meat provided dense protein and fat. Workers were likely divided into rotating shifts, with fresh teams arriving during Nile inundation seasons when farming was impossible. New teams meant new mouths, but also rested muscles. The system, in all its dusty monotony, worked. In fact, when Egypt suffered famine or economic instability, pyramid building slowed or stopped. That's how closely the project was tied to food supply and resource distribution. You couldn't build for the afterlife if the living couldn't eat. Faith in stone. While most workers weren't priests or nobles, religious belief still played a role in their daily labor. Many Egyptians believed in metacosmic balance. That required humans to perform their roles in harmony. Building a pyramid wasn't just construction. It was maintaining that by ensuring the pharaoh's soul reached the afterlife properly. That meant your role, whether lifting a block or baking bread, had spiritual significance. It gave meaning to exhaustion, even if you were skeptical. Even if you cursed the dust in your nose or the foreman's whip, some part of you might have believed that this suffering had a purpose, that it would ripple forward into eternity. You may have even carved a small prayer into a limestone fragment, placed it at the base of a wall, and whispered a wish for your children's health as you returned to your shift. These weren't slaves. They were believers, or, at the very least, participants in a system that gave suffering meaning. A life measured in stony, and still the pyramid grew. Day after day, year after year, each block laid was a mark of time. For the builders, it wasn't one project, it was a life. A young man might begin lifting stones in his teens, grow into a foreman by 30, and die before the summit was complete. Imagine standing on that plateau, looking at the pyramid not as a whole, but as a series of layers you helped raise. You wouldn't see grandeur, you'd see effort, hunger, routine, and maybe, just maybe, pride. But what happened to the pyramid workers after the projects ended? When Pharaoh Khufu died, and the project wrapped up, and new rulers chose other priorities? What became of the men who'd given their youth to a dead man's tomb? The last block was laid. It wasn't grand or ceremonial. There was no golden capstone, no parade of priests climbing the final steps to the heavens. Instead, there was dust, a lot of dust, and quiet. You might not have even seen it happen. The final crews were smaller, finishing details far above your reach. You were likely reassigned by then to another task, another site, or perhaps you left on your own. A laborer's body worn thin and ready for rest. The Great Pyramid of Giza had been completed. Khufu was buried within, and for the people who built it tens of thousands over decades, what followed was far less certain than stone. This is the part of the story where history usually fades. The monument remains. The names of kings are carved deep into granite, but the builders vanish. Their muscles, their diets, their gang nicknames, they leave behind fragments, not stories. So let's gather what we know and reconstruct not just a pyramid, but what it meant to stop building. When the work ran out, the end of construction was not abrupt. It came slowly, in stages, finishing the burial chamber, sealing interior passages, smoothing outer casing stones, aligning mortuary temples. And then the site was handed over to priests and caretakers. The village of workers, once alive with shouting foremen, clanging copper tools, and the smell of fresh bread, quieted. Some laborers were likely absorbed into other state projects. Road work, canal dredging, temple building. Egypt's bureaucracy had always found ways to redirect manpower. But not everyone stayed in government service. Some returned to their home villages along the Nile. These men arrived stronger than when they left, skilled in stonework, toolmaking, or logistics. They brought with them stories, knowledge, perhaps even a modest amount of status. Working on the pyramid wasn't just a job. It was a mark of experience, the kind of detail that changed your place in a rural village. You had seen things, lived through harsh seasons, labor beneath the king's eye. But there were others who didn't return, who stayed near the shadow of the pyramid, trying to find new purpose in a place that had lost its central mission. And some, of course, were buried right there beneath the sand, not far from the thing they helped create. Tools down, memory up. What happens to a society after it completes its largest project? The end of pyramid building at Giza marked a turning point in Egypt's identity. Later dynasties would build other pyramids, but none would match the scale or ambition of Khufu's. In many ways, the Great Pyramid was a peak not just architecturally, but socially. The systems that had kept it running were hard to replicate. Later pharaohs struggled to marshal the same resources. Economic strain, environmental changes, and political shifts made massive labor projects less sustainable. In other words, the men who built the Great Pyramid may have been the last generation to work at such an impossible scale. That might explain the reverence we see in later graffiti and tomb inscriptions. Even centuries later, Egyptians reference the pyramid, aged with a kind of sacred nostalgia. These weren't just builders, they were the instruments of divine ambition. Ordinary people had touched eternity, one limestone block at a time. But if you were one of them, still alive in the quiet years, after completion, did it feel like that? Or did it feel like unemployment? Daily life in a monument's shadow, there's a kind of psychological strangeness in seeing your life's work turned into a tourist destination for priests. After the pyramid was finished, The mortuary complex remained active. Priests tended to Khufu's cult, performing rites, maintaining offerings. These temples provided some ongoing jobs: scribes, guards, gardeners. But for former builders, it was different. You might walk past the Great Stone Causeway and hear prayers echoing where hammers once rang. You might see white-robed priests stepping over the dust of your tools, speaking of the pharaoh's divine nature with no mention of the gangs who hauled each block into place. What did that feel like? Did you feel pride, or something more like erasure? The unmarked builders. If you stand before the Great Pyramid today, you will see no statue of a laborer, no monument to the men who bled their hands shaping rock beneath a brutal sun. Their names are mostly gone. Their stories survive only in fragments, bones, bits of papyrus, camp graffiti. But in those fragments, a story emerges, one that has little to do with kings and gods. It's the story of workers who formed one of the most sophisticated project logistics systems in ancient history, of men who, fed on bread and beer, created something that still inspires awe across millennia, of a civilization that understood how to move mountains because it could first move people. And in the end, maybe that's the legacy that matters. Not the tomb, not the treasure, but the process, the coordination, the shared endurance. A pyramid is a grave, yes, but it's also a collaboration. And so we're left with a final question. If you spent half your life helping build something eternal, and then walked away from it forever, did it still belong to you? Or did it now belong only to the dead? What toilets were like in 3000 BC while you are in a city? But it doesn't look like any city you know. The year is roughly 3000 BC, and the word city is still a new idea, barely forming in the minds of the people who live here. The buildings are made of sun-dried mud brick, packed tightly into clusters with narrow alleyways threading between them like dried riverbeds. There is no marble, no arches, no sweeping roads. The air smells of earth, smoke, sweat, and something else, something sour and vaguely familiar. It is the smell of human life pressed into tight spaces without sewers, pipes, or drains. Because toilets, at least the kind you might imagine, do not exist here in the way we think of them. But waste still needs to go somewhere, and so begins one of the least glamorous, most essential parts of human civilization: figuring out where and how to relieve oneself in a world that hasn't invented plumbing yet. You are in the city of Mohenjo-Daro, or perhaps in ancient Europe, or maybe high in a mountain village in Anatolia. It doesn't matter exactly where. What matters is that people here, thousands of years ago, already understood something we often forget. Sanitation is survival. Waste, if left unmanaged, brings disease, insects, and ruin. So in the absence of toilets, there were pits. Simple ones dug outside homes, often lined with clay to slow the seep of filth into the earth. Some were shared between a few households. Others were more private, just a hole covered with a stone slab and a small depression for sitting. Occasionally, people added sand or ash to reduce odor. In wealthier homes of certain ancient cities like Mohenjo-Daro, small brick cubicles with drainage holes have been found. These are perhaps the earliest known examples of private toilets. Though calling them toilets might be generous, there was no water tank, no flush, no privacy curtain, just a space where someone could squat and let gravity do the rest. In some cases, a rudimentary drainage system carried waste outside the house via terracotta pipes or sloped stone channels, and that astonishingly is as close to indoor plumbing as the world would get for another couple of thousand years. But not everyone had such luxuries. For most, going to the toilet meant going outside. It meant walking to the edge of the settlement, to the midden heaps, to the designated night soil areas. Sometimes people used pots or small vessels, especially at night, which were then dumped outside in the morning. These were not necessarily clay chamber pots. Many were just wide-mouthed jars, repurposed from storing food or water. That proximity between waste and sustenance would seem horrifying now. But it was a daily negotiation back then, and it wasn't unique. Similar systems existed across the ancient world. In parts of Egypt, small niches within homes served as bathrooms, with waste dropped through chutes into pits below. In Crete's early Minoan settlements, sophisticated stone channels carried not just water, but also sewage. Yet all of these systems were patchwork solutions, fragile, labor-intensive, and easily overwhelmed. The problem wasn't just engineering, it was cultural. For many early societies, waste was both a practical and spiritual issue. Human excrement was often seen as impure, contaminating not just the body but the soul. Some cultures required ritual cleansing after defecation. Others designated separate areas far from dwellings as unclean zones. In the Indus Valley, the separation of waste areas from living spaces suggests an early awareness of public health. But these customs weren't consistent. In other parts of the ancient world, waste was casually discarded into streets or rivers, contaminating water, supplies, and spreading illness. Archaeological digs reveal that even where sanitation systems existed, they weren't always used as intended. People dumped refuse in streets, latrines overflowed, and drainage channels clogged with bones, pottery shards, and ash. Sanitation was an ideal, rarely a consistent reality. In cities like Mohenjo-Daro, the drainage systems were remarkably advanced. Brick-lined channels ran beneath streets, connected to soak pits that filtered out solid waste. Homes were linked to these channels by small corbelled tunnels. But even here, there was no guarantee that everyone used them properly. Maintaining a city-wide sewage system requires collective discipline, regular upkeep, and a shared understanding of its value. Without those, even the most ingenious design becomes a breeding ground for disease. And so the reality of daily life remained messy. Human waste was part of the landscape, smelled, stepped around, and rarely discussed. In many early settlements, there was no distinction between trash and sewage. Both ended up in refuse pits, often located downhill or downwind. The poor might relieve themselves wherever they could, behind walls, in abandoned courtyards, or directly into rivers. Water sources were sometimes used for both drinking and defecation, a practice that would seem horrifying today but was often based on necessity, not ignorance. It wasn't that ancient people didn't care about hygiene. They just lacked the means to separate clean from dirty as effectively as we do now. In some places, the boundary between sacred and profane was blurred. Temples might include ritual cleansing pools but sit adjacent to trash heaps. Public squares might host gatherings by day and serve as latrines by night, and still, people adapted. They developed customs to navigate this reality, washing hands with ash or sand, avoiding certain areas at certain times, passing down oral traditions about where not to step or sit. These details rarely make it into textbooks. They're not carved into monuments or mentioned in epic poems, but they were as vital to survival as farming or warfare. Knowing where to go and where not to go was part of staying alive. You might wonder what people thought about all this. Was there shame, disgust, or was it just another part of the day, like grinding grain or fetching water? The answer likely depends on who you were. A wealthy merchant with access to a semi-private latrine might feel pride in that small luxury. A laborer squatting beside a wall might not give it a second thought. Children would have learned the rules early: where to go, how to clean, what not to touch. And so the knowledge passed silently from generation to generation. There is no statue commemorating the first person to dig a proper latrine, no holiday for the invention of drainage. Yet these humble actions celebrated and unseen shaped cities as surely as kings and wars. Without waste management, civilization itself begins to rot. And so you're left with this image: a mud brick house, a low brick seat, a clay pot beneath it. No pipes, no water, just silence, the faint hum of flies, and the knowledge that someone, thousands of years ago, figured out how to make this moment a little more bearable. But here's the question: if ancient cities already had rudimentary toilets and drains, Why did so many later civilizations forget how to use them? You follow a narrow stone path worn smooth by bare feet and time. The city around you, perhaps it's Lagash or early Thebes, or even a hilltop town near Catalhu, rises and folds around itself like baked dough. There are no street signs. The lanes twist based on ancient foot traffic, not architectural plans. But eventually, you arrive at what served as the communal heart of sanitation, the shared latrine. In places where private toilets were rare or non-existent, these were the closest thing to public restrooms. They might be simple trench latrines dug into the earth, lined with stones to prevent collapse. Or they could be long benches of wood or brick with holes cut evenly across the top, like seats in a silent theater. Some cities, such as later Roman ones, though far beyond 3000 BC, made these spaces social. But here, in the Bronze Age, they were likely more utilitarian, less communal in spirit, but equally vital in function. You imagine a person, perhaps a farmer returning from the fields, or a brewer on a break from crushing barley, making their way to one of these communal pits. They wait their turn, they squat, they go. Then, if the culture allowed or required it, they might cleanse themselves with a scrap of cloth, a smooth pebble, or a splash of water drawn from a small jar. Toilet paper did not exist. Instead, people used what was around them. In Mesopotamia, sometimes sand, in parts of Egypt, perhaps reeds or worn linen. You might be surprised to learn that the use of water was common. Rudimentary washing, sometimes even ritual ablution, was part of the toileting process. In the Indus Valley cities, small rooms with drainage channels beside what appear to be latrines suggest washing was expected after relieving oneself. In fact, water and waste were often managed together in early cities. It wasn't just a matter of disposal, it was an understanding, primitive, perhaps, but insightful, that waste could foul a water source. That cleanliness wasn't merely comfort, but protection. That's why in places like Mohenjo-Daro, city blocks were laid out with a basic drainage logic. Rainwater and wastewater moved through sloped stone-lined channels. And though not everyone used them correctly, their existence tells us something important. Ancient people thought about these systems. They experimented, they failed, they tried. Again, for instance, terracotta sewer pipes have been found running under the streets of the Indus cities, connecting to pits or cesspools. Some were even capped with bricks to reduce odor. But these weren't centralized systems as we'd understand them now. They were patchworks, homeowners digging out their own soak pits, or neighborhoods pulling labor to maintain a shared channel. The city didn't do it for them. The idea of a municipal sanitation department was millennia away. But even in 3000 BC, you see the beginnings of collective infrastructure. Because when a latrine overflowed or a drain backed up, it wasn't just one household that suffered. Disease spread, smell spread, and complaints spread too. Though not in the form of bureaucratic reports. Instead, rules emerged, unwritten at first, then carved into clay tablets or painted on walls. In Mesopotamia, one early legal code, the Laws of Eshunana, dating a bit later, mentions penalties for fouling public water sources. In ancient Egypt, temple priests oversaw sanitation around sacred sites, and certain rituals couldn't be performed unless the body was purified. Sanitation wasn't just a practical concern, it became moral. In some cases, even divine. Take, for example, the concept of cleanliness in ancient Mesopotamian religion. Priests and priestesses were often required to bathe multiple times a day. Their bodies were considered vessels for the gods, and anything unclean, bodily waste included, could disrupt the connection. Before entering a temple, one might need to wash, change clothes, or recite specific incantations. These practices slowly bled into civil life. In some settlements, latrines were placed near wells not just out of convenience, but because proximity to water was seen as spiritually purifying. Of course, this led to contamination issues, but people didn't yet have germ theory. They were operating by logic rooted in experience and ritual. And yet, despite all these systems, all these ideas, most waste still ended up back in the soil. Midden heaps, the piles of refuse that grew like small hills outside ancient settlements, were mixtures of ash, broken pottery, bones, charcoal, and excrement. Some grew so large that they became landmarks. People dumped their pots there. Sometimes they buried the waste, especially in times of disease or drought. But often they didn't. The same place where a family might have once celebrated a birth or held a festival could, years later, be part of the community waste heap. There was no zoning, no separation of public and private space in the modern since that, so people developed other ways of managing proximity. They burned dung. This wasn't just disposal, it was energy. In arid regions, dried animal and sometimes human waste became fuel for cooking. It sounds shocking, but it made practical sense. Dung burned slowly and at low heat, ideal for simmering grains. Families might set aside piles of it, mixing in straw to make them easier to light. In some places, this was a family chore, gathering, drying, stacking fuel for the hearth. Even waste, then, became part of the economy. It was no longer just something to get rid of. It was something to use. And this use bred new customs, new expectations, and new taboos that not everyone participated equally. Though, as in most parts of ancient life, class shaped your experience. A household with servants might never think about where waste went. Someone else handled it. A temple worker might use a semi-private latrine. A slave or low-caste labor might be required to empty pots or dig new pits outside the settlement. There were no uniforms, no gloves, just hands and endurance, and occasionally, perhaps, small tokens of thanks, scraps of food, a place to sleep, rarely anything more. These workers weren't remembered in monuments. Their names weren't carved into history. Yet without them, early cities would have drowned in their own filth. And so, step by step, civilization taught itself to cope. It learned where to put its waste and when to move it. It learned that water must flow away, not toward. It learned that a drain isn't just a hole in the wall, but a line between life and disease. These lessons were slow, scattered, and sometimes forgotten, because as we'll see, history is not a straight line. Even civilizations that once built drains and toilets often lost the knowledge. In the chaos of collapse. And that brings us to a strange puzzle. Why did some ancient societies stop using toilets entirely? Why did the knowledge of sanitation sometimes disappear? Imagine walking through the ruins of an ancient city, its baked brick walls crumbling under centuries of wind and rain. The streets are silent now, but beneath your feet lie the faint remains of drainage channels, buried soak pits, and the outlines of what were once latrines. This city, perhaps in the Indus Valley, perhaps in a forgotten Sumerian outpost, once had rudimentary toilets and drains. Its people worked out how to handle waste in ways surprisingly efficient for their time. And yet, within a few generations, all of it vanished. That's one of the most bewildering facts about early sanitation. In multiple ancient societies, we find sophisticated systems, terracotta sewer pipes, latrines connected to street-level drains, public waste pits arranged with care. But then, we see something that feels counterintuitive. Those systems are abandoned. Future generations don't improve them, they forget them. When Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa collapsed around 1900 BC, the next waves of settlements across the region showed almost no trace of similar sanitation. In Mesopotamia, later cities like Babylon and Nineveh had grandeur and spades towering ziggurats. Libraries, gardens, but often relied on cesspools and street dumping rather than the covered drainage of earlier towns. The reasons for this reversal are hard to pin down. Partly, it's about the fragility of infrastructure. Sanitation systems need regular maintenance. Clay pipes crack, drains clog, soap pits fill. without a governing body or a shared civic will to keep them functional. Even the best systems break down, and when cities shrink or crumble due to drought, invasion, or internal decay, the knowledge of how to build and manage waste systems often goes with them. Builders die, crafts are forgotten, priorities shift. That is also cultural. Sanitation is deeply tied to how a society views the body, purity, and labor. If waste becomes a private shame or a low-class task, people stop thinking of it as something worth engineering. They hide it rather than solve it. They manage it informally, with makeshift pits and dumps, hoping the rains will wash it away. And sometimes, astonishingly, that becomes normal. In fact, many early towns had to rediscover toilets again and again. Ancient Egypt, for example, had basin-style latrines in the Old Kingdom circa 2500 BC, but in later periods, many homes simply use pots or dispose of waste in the open. Even Athens, in classical Greece, had public toilets, but most homes lacked anything resembling a modern lavatory. And in some medieval settlements built atop ancient Roman cities, people literally dumped waste into the ruins of aqueducts and sewers that no one knew how to repair anymore.